A Soviet spy rented an apartment facing the White House. But the view from his window hid something far more dangerous than anyone imagined. In 1975, a well-dressed couple signed a lease on Wisconsin Avenue in Washington, D.C. To their neighbors, they were just another professional pair. He worked in telecommunications. She translated documents. They brought cookies to building parties. They chatted about the weather. For 10 years, no one suspected the truth. Behind their living room wall, hidden inside what looked like ordinary furniture, was one of the most sophisticated listening devices ever planted on American soil. Every phone call from the State Department, every Pentagon conversation, every diplomatic secret floating through the air, all of it captured, recorded, and sent straight to Moscow. The FBI knew something was wrong. Electronic interference that shouldn't exist. Classified information leaking before it was even written down. But what they discovered in apartment 4B would reveal something even more disturbing. Because inside the personal journal of the female spy, between the coded messages and surveillance notes, were pages that would shake both American and Soviet intelligence to their core. She had written, "We came here to steal their secrets. Instead, they stole our souls." I'm curious, where are you watching from tonight? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to hear more untold stories from the Cold War's shadow world, the human stories buried in classified files for decades, make sure to subscribe, because what you're about to discover will change how you see the entire Cold War. Now, let's go back to that September morning in 1985, when FBI agents surrounded a quiet apartment building in Northwest Washington, and the decade-long deception finally came to light. The arrest happened quietly, without drama, without the violence one might expect from the end of a decade-long espionage operation. On that September morning in 1985, FBI agents didn't kick down the door of apartment 4B. They knocked politely, identified themselves calmly, and waited while the man they knew as Stanley Gusev opened the door he'd opened 1,000 times before to neighbors, delivery men, and friends who never suspected what lay behind it. Gusev didn't run. He didn't reach for a weapon or a cyanide pill. He simply nodded, as if he'd been expecting this moment for years. Perhaps he had. Perhaps every morning for 10 years, he'd wondered if this would be the day the performance ended. To understand how a Soviet intelligence officer could live undetected in the heart of Washington, D.C., mere blocks from the center of American power, we need to go back to the beginning. Not just to 1975, when Gusev arrived, but to Moscow, years earlier, where the operation was born in the sterile rooms of the GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence. The year was 1973, and détente between the superpowers had created a peculiar paradox. While Nixon and Brezhnev shook hands for the cameras, their intelligence services escalated their shadow war. The Soviets had a problem. Their embassy in Washington was under constant FBI surveillance. Every diplomat was followed, every phone call monitored, every meeting photographed. They needed eyes and ears outside the embassy's watched walls. They needed what the intelligence world called illegals, deep-cover operatives with no official connection to the Soviet Union. Stanislav Gusev was selected from hundreds of candidates. Born in 1942 in Leningrad, he'd survived the siege as an infant, though he had no memory of those 900 days of hunger and bombardment. His talent for languages emerged early. By university, he spoke English with an American accent so perfect that his instructors, themselves American defectors, couldn't detect a trace of foreign origin. But language was only part of his gift. Gusev possessed something rarer: the ability to become someone else entirely, to hold two identities in his mind without losing himself in either. His training took 4 years, not in some remote Siberian facility, but in a mock American town built outside Moscow, complete with a gas station, a diner, and a small movie theater that showed Hollywood films. Here, Gusev learned to pump gas the American way, to order eggs over easy with hash browns, to complain about the Redskins' defensive line. He read every issue of Time magazine, memorized baseball statistics, learned to do his taxes using IRS forms smuggled out by other agents. But the most crucial part of his preparation wasn't American culture. It was American loneliness. His handlers understood that the deepest cover required the deepest isolation. Gusev would have no handler in Washington, no dead drops for the first year, no contact with the embassy. He would be completely alone with his mission and his false identity. The woman selected as his operational partner, they would pose as husband and wife, was Galina Yakova, a signals intelligence specialist who'd spent her childhood in East Berlin, where her father worked as a communications officer. She had a gift for electronics, and an even greater gift for appearing ordinary. In photographs from her training period, she looks like someone you'd pass in a grocery store without a second glance. This invisibility was her weapon. Together, they rehearsed their cover story until it became more real than memory. They were Stanley and Helen Gusev, married in Cleveland in 1970. He'd studied electrical engineering at Ohio State. She was a freelance translator specializing in technical manuals. They'd moved to Washington for his work with a telecommunications consulting firm, a real company, secretly funded by Soviet intelligence through a maze of shell corporations. In March 1975, they flew from Montreal to Washington National Airport. Their Canadian passports, masterfully forged, showed years of normal travel. In their luggage, clothes from J.C. bought by other agents in Columbus, Ohio, and worn just enough to look natural. Family photos, carefully staged in that mock American town. A wallet-sized picture of Helen's supposed mother, actually a retired GRU secretary who'd never left Russia. The apartment on Wisconsin Avenue had been selected months in advance by another illegal, who'd since returned to Moscow. The building was perfect, old enough to have settled walls that would hide modifications, new enough to have modern electrical systems, positioned at precisely the right angle to intercept microwave transmissions bouncing between government buildings. On their first night in apartment 4B, while Helen unpacked their American life from cardboard boxes, Stanley stood at the window that would define the next decade of their existence. Below, Wisconsin Avenue stretched toward the Potomac. To the east, the National Cathedral's tower caught the setting sun. And there, visible between the buildings if you knew where to look, was the White House. He would later tell his Soviet debriefers that in that moment he felt not triumph, but vertigo. The mission that had seemed abstract in Moscow was suddenly real. Every person walking below was an American whose secrets he'd come to steal. Every light in every window represented a life he would violate with his listening devices. Helen joined him at the window. They didn't speak. Their training had taught them to assume surveillance from day one. But she touched his hand briefly, a gesture that could mean anything to watching eyes, but communicated everything to him. We're here. There's no way back. The performance has begun. Within a week, they'd met their neighbors. Mrs. Patterson from 4B, recently widowed, who would become Helen's closest friend. Jim Morrison, the building superintendent, a Vietnam veteran who appreciated Stanley's quiet demeanor and firm handshake. The Johnstons from down the hall, whose daughter would sometimes leave her tricycle outside the Gusevs' door, prompting Helen to keep a bowl of candy by the entrance. The normality was intoxicating. After years of preparation, of being Soviet agents preparing to be Americans, they were suddenly just Americans. Stanley joined the building's maintenance committee. Helen volunteered at the local library's literacy program. They attended 4th of July barbecues on the building's roof, watching fireworks explode over the monuments to American democracy, while Soviet intelligence equipment hummed quietly in their apartment below. The transformation of apartment 4B from a home into a listening post took 3 months of meticulous work. Stanley Gusev would wake at 5 each morning, before the city stirred, and begin modifications that had to be invisible to any casual observer. A lamp rewired to hide an antenna. A bookshelf with a false back concealing signal processors. The television that worked perfectly, but whose cathode ray tube had been modified to display intercepted fax transmissions after midnight. The equipment itself arrived in pieces, hidden in shipments of legitimate electronics ordered by Stanley's consulting firm. A spectrum analyzer came disguised as stereo components. Receivers were built into clock radios. The most sophisticated device, a scanner capable of intercepting car phone conversations from 2 miles away, was assembled from parts spread across 12 different packages, each innocent on its own. devastating when combined. By day, Stanley worked legitimate contracts for his cover company, installing phone systems in small businesses around the capital. Each job provided two benefits: a reason to be seen with telecommunications equipment and access to the city's communication infrastructure. He learned which buildings had which phone systems, which government offices used which radio frequencies, where the weak points were in Washington's electronic architecture. Helen's role was equally crucial, but entirely different. While Stanley gathered the signals, she processed them. Her cover as a translator wasn't entirely false. She did take legitimate freelance work, translating technical manuals from German and French. But her real work began after dark, when she'd sit with headphones in their bedroom, transcribing intercepted conversations, identifying voices, building a map of Washington's power structure one phone call at a time. The intelligence they gathered in those first years exceeded Moscow's wildest expectations. Not state secrets at first. Those were too well protected. Instead, they collected the metadata of American government life, which Pentagon officials called which contractors, which State Department employees met for drinks after work, who was having affairs, who was in debt, who drank too much at embassy parties. One evening in November 1977, their equipment captured something extraordinary. A senior CIA officer, sitting in traffic on Wisconsin Avenue, called his mistress from his car phone. In his attempt to explain why he'd be late for their rendezvous, he mentioned the mess in Tehran and that he'd be burning files all night. This was 3 days before the public learned about the deteriorating situation in Iran. Moscow knew about the embassy's vulnerability before most of the American government did. But the human cost of this success grew heavier with each passing month. Helen began suffering migraines from hours of wearing headphones. Stanley developed insomnia, lying awake replaying conversations he'd intercepted, wondering about the lives he was destroying without their knowledge. They were drowning in other people's secrets, while their own secret consumed them from within. The pressure manifested in unexpected ways. Helen started a garden on the building's roof, growing tomatoes and herbs with an obsessive attention that worried Stanley. She would spend hours tending plants, talking to them in Russian when she thought no one could hear, as if the vegetables were the only things in her life that weren't lies. Stanley took up running, pushing himself through Rock Creek Park before dawn, running until his lungs burned and his mind finally stopped processing intelligence. Their relationship, never a real marriage but forced to perform as one, became a complex dance of professional partnership and manufactured intimacy. They shared a bed because surveillance might detect separate rooms. They held hands in public because couples do. They learned each other's habits, preferences, and fears not from love, but from operational necessity. Yet somewhere in the performance, something genuine grew. Not romance, but a deep understanding that only two people living the same impossible life could share. The crisis came in 1979 with the building renovation. When management announced new windows would be installed, Stanley knew their entire operation was at risk. The old windows had been carefully modified to be transparent to radio waves. New ones would block the signals they depended on. He had 48 hours to find a solution. The answer came from Helen. She suggested they volunteer to coordinate the renovation schedule, claiming she suffered from severe chemical sensitivities and needed to control the timing of work on their floor. Stanley charmed the building supervisor with tickets to Redskins games, purchased with Moscow's money but requiring Stanley to actually attend, to learn the sport, to care about first downs and field goals he'd never grown up watching. During the renovation, they worked in shifts. While workers installed windows in one room, Stanley and Helen frantically concealed equipment in another. They hid antennas inside the new weatherproofing. They convinced workers to use special caulk, actually a compound developed by Soviet scientists to maintain electromagnetic transparency, by claiming Helen was allergic to standard materials. The renovation supervisor, a gregarious man named Tony, took a liking to Stanley. He invited him for beers after work, wanting to discuss the Redskins' chances that season. Stanley went, knowing that refusing would seem suspicious. He found himself in a Georgetown bar, surrounded by construction workers, debating American football, while his mind calculated how many state secrets were passing through the air around them. Unencrypted, unprotected, waiting to be captured by the equipment hidden in his apartment. By 1982, Stanley and Helen Gusev had become fixtures in their neighborhood's ecosystem. Helen served on the library board. Stanley coached youth basketball at the community center. They attended church on Christmas and Easter, not from faith, but because absence would be noticed. Their American life had developed its own momentum, carrying them forward even as their Russian selves grew more distant, like voices calling from the bottom of a well. The intelligence flowing through apartment 4B had evolved from metadata to gold. They'd intercepted discussions about Pershing missile deployments in Europe, debates about funding Afghani rebels, private Pentagon assessments of Soviet military capabilities that revealed how much the Americans actually knew. One conversation between two State Department officials, caught while they carpooled down Wisconsin Avenue, provided Moscow with the entire American negotiating position for upcoming arms control talks. But the most valuable intelligence often came from the most human moments. A CIA analyst calling his ex-wife, begging to see his children, mentioning he'd be in Berlin next week for the usual reasons. An NSC staffer, drunk after an embassy party, calling a friend and confessing his doubt about Reagan's Soviet strategy, wondering aloud if they were pushing too hard, risking war over ideology. These fragments, these moments of weakness and honesty, painted a picture of American intelligence that no satellite could capture. The psychological toll manifested in Helen first. She began keeping a journal, a catastrophic breach of protocol that would have earned immediate recall if Moscow knew. Hidden inside a hollowed-out cookbook, she wrote in a cipher of her own creation, not Russian or English, but a hybrid language that reflected her fractured identity. The entries revealed a woman disappearing into her own cover story. One entry from July 1982 read, "Mrs. Patterson invited me for tea again. She showed me photos of her late husband, told me how he died of cancer last spring, how she held his hand at the end. She cried. I held her. I wanted to tell her that my father died in Stalingrad, that I understood loss. Instead, I told her about Helen's fictional father in Cleveland. I'm lying to a grieving woman about grief. What have I become?" Stanley noticed the change in his partner. She'd stopped eating regular meals, surviving on coffee and crackers while she transcribed intercepted conversations. She'd begun talking to herself in English, even when they were alone, as if Russian might give them away to the walls themselves. Most disturbing, she'd started believing elements of their cover story. She spoke about Helen's mother in Cleveland, as if she were real. Worried about her health, suggested they should visit for Thanksgiving. The pressure on Stanley was different, but equally corrosive. His morning runs had extended to 2 hours. He'd run to the Lincoln Memorial, stand before the seated president, and wonder what Lincoln would think of a Russian spy seeking solace at his feet. He'd developed a friendship with Jim Morrison, the building superintendent, that transcended operational necessity. Jim had served 2 tours in Vietnam, had nightmares about firefights in jungle darkness. Stanley found himself genuinely caring about this American veteran, even as he stole secrets that might send Jim's son to another war. Moscow, sensing something through the subtle changes in their reports, initiated contact through a complex series of signals. A chalk mark on a mailbox in DuPont Circle led Stanley to a dead drop in Rock Creek Park, where he found new instructions and equipment. The message was clear: accelerate intelligence gathering. Relations between the superpowers were deteriorating. Every piece of information could be crucial. The new equipment included something revolutionary, a device that could intercept computer data transmitted over phone lines. The digital age was dawning, and Moscow wanted its secrets. Stanley spent weeks integrating the system, learning to capture the screech of modems and convert them into readable data. The first successful interception was a Pentagon report on Soviet satellite vulnerabilities, transmitted from a home computer to the Defense Department. The Cold War had entered cyberspace, but with greater capability came greater risk. The new equipment generated heat and electrical interference. Neighbors began complaining about television reception problems. The building supervisor, Jim, Stanley's friend, mentioned that the power company had questions about unusual electrical consumption patterns on their floor. Stanley had to think fast, claiming Helen had taken up pottery, that they'd installed a kiln in the spare bedroom. He actually had to buy a kiln, had to have Helen learn pottery, had to produce misshapen bowls and vases to maintain the lie within the lie. The near discovery shook them both. That night, for the first time in 7 years, they discussed ending the operation. Not defecting, that thought remained unspoken, but requesting extraction, claiming illness, returning to a Moscow they barely remembered. Helen sat at the window, looking out at the lights of the capital, and said something that chilled Stanley. "I don't know if I remember how to be Russian anymore. What if we go back and discover we can't be ourselves there either?" The beginning of the end came from an unexpected source. In March 1985, Vitaly Yurchenko, a senior KGB officer with 25 years of service, sat in a Rome cafe, wrestling with a decision that would reshape Cold War intelligence. For months, he'd been growing disillusioned with the Soviet system, haunted by the faces of agents he'd sent to their deaths, exhausted by the endless deception. That afternoon, he walked into the U.S. Embassy and uttered 5 words that would doom dozens of Soviet operations. "I want to come over." Stanley and Helen knew nothing of Yurchenko's defection. Their world had narrowed to the routines that kept their cover intact and their sanity functional. Helen's pottery had actually become accomplished, her pieces sold at local craft fairs, the money going to charity because Moscow's funds were already sufficient. Stanley had joined a bowling league with Jim Morrison and other veterans, learning to celebrate strikes and commiserate over splits while his mind processed the intelligence he'd gathered that day. Their equipment had captured something extraordinary the week before Yurchenko's defection. A conference call between CIA, NSC, and Pentagon officials discussing a new strategic defense initiative. The details were technical, encrypted in military jargon, but the implications were clear. America was planning to militarize space, to build a shield that would render Soviet missiles obsolete. Stanley had transmitted this intelligence to Moscow with the highest priority coding. He didn't know that Yurchenko had been one of the officers who received it. In Washington, FBI counterintelligence had been patiently building their case for years. They called it Operation Courtyard, a systematic investigation of unexplained intelligence leaks. They'd noticed patterns, information appearing in Soviet hands before it was officially distributed, diplomatic positions compromised before negotiations began, technical secrets surfacing in Moscow's research facilities. The leaks pointed to a source in Washington, someone with access to multiple communication streams. The FBI's break came from mundane detective work. They'd mapped electrical anomalies across the capital, looking for unusual consumption patterns that might indicate surveillance equipment. They'd studied rental records, searching for tenants who paid in cash, who had minimal credit histories, whose backgrounds seemed too perfect. They'd analyzed thousands of photographs from diplomatic events, identifying faces that appeared too often to be coincidental. Stanley and Helen appeared on 3 separate FBI lists. Their electrical usage was suspicious. Their credit history, while complete, began abruptly in 1970, and Stanley's face had been photographed at 17 different embassy receptions he'd attended as part of his telecommunications work. None of this was proof, but together it painted a picture. Then Yurchenko began talking. Among the treasures in his memory was knowledge of an operation he'd only heard about in whispers, a listening post in Washington, run by GRU, not KGB, operating from a residential building with a view of government facilities. He didn't know names or addresses, but he knew it had been running for approximately 10 years and had provided extraordinary intelligence on American communications. The FBI narrowed their search to buildings with the right profile, residential, with sightlines to government buildings, with tenants who'd been in place for a decade. The list had 43 addresses. They began surveillance on all of them, looking for patterns, anomalies, anything that might confirm Yurchenko's intelligence. Stanley noticed the surveillance on August 15, 1985. It was subtle. A van parked too long, a jogger who passed twice, a new tenant who asked too many questions. His training kicked in. Without changing his routine, He activated protocols for emergency destruction of materials. He began slowly reducing the amount of equipment in the apartment, claiming to Helen they were upgrading systems. In reality, he was preparing for the end. Helen sensed it too. Her migraines had worsened, but she refused to see a doctor, knowing medical records might expose them. She stopped writing in her journal, instead burning pages one by one in the sink, watching her thoughts turn to ash. At night, she would stand at the window, looking out at the city lights, and whisper in Russian, "They're coming. I can feel them coming." The final weeks took on a surreal quality. They maintained their cover with desperate perfection. Stanley attended Jim Morrison's birthday party, bringing imported vodka and listening to Vietnam stories, while knowing FBI agents were probably photographing every guest. Helen had coffee with Mrs. Patterson, discussing library fundraising while her hands shook so badly she had to hide them under the table. On September 3rd, they intercepted a transmission that made Stanley's blood freeze. It was FBI tactical communication, encrypted, but on a frequency they'd been monitoring. He couldn't decode it entirely, but he recognized operational language, coordination protocols. They were planning something. Soon. That night, Stanley and Helen sat in their living room, surrounded by the artifacts of their American life. Photos from building picnics, Helen's pottery, Stanley's bowling trophy, the thank you card from the youth basketball team. 10 years of deception had created something they hadn't expected, a life they would mourn losing. On the morning of September 12, 1985, Stanley Gusev woke before dawn for the last time in apartment 4B. He didn't run that day. Instead, he sat at the window where it had all begun, watching Wisconsin Avenue wake beneath him. Delivery trucks rumbled past. Early commuters hurried toward the metro. The mundane rhythms of American life continued, unaware that above them, a decade of deception was about to end. Helen was destroying the last of the evidence, feeding papers into the bathtub where she'd set controlled fires that left nothing but ash to wash down the drain. Her journal was already gone, but she'd kept one page, the entry about Mrs. Patterson's husband dying. She held it for a long moment, then added it to the flames. Some truths were too dangerous to preserve, even in ashes. At exactly 7:43 a.m., the knock came. 3 measured raps, professional but not aggressive. Stanley had disabled the equipment the night before, ensuring no electrical fires, no dramatic destruction that might harm the neighbors he'd come to care about. He looked at Helen. She nodded, straightening her dress, preparing for the performance's final act. When Stanley opened the door, he found Agent Robert Chen of FBI counterintelligence, flanked by 4 other agents. Chen would later write in his report that Gusev showed no surprise, no fear, only what he described as profound exhaustion, like a man finally allowed to put down a weight he'd carried too long. The arrest was civilized to the point of surrealism. Chen allowed Stanley to properly shut down the remaining equipment, even expressing professional admiration for the sophistication of the setup. Helen was permitted to water her rooftop plants one last time. They were allowed to leave a note for Mrs. Patterson, saying they'd been called away on a family emergency. A final lie to protect a friend from the truth. As they were let out, Jim Morrison was returning from his night shift. He saw Stanley in handcuffs, Helen surrounded by agents. Their eyes met for a moment. Jim would later tell investigators that Stanley mouthed 2 words, "I'm sorry." Jim never spoke about that morning again, not even to his wife. The interrogations revealed the operation's stunning scope. For 10 years, Apartment 4B had intercepted thousands of sensitive communications, military movements, diplomatic strategies, personal blackmail material on scores of government employees. The intelligence had influenced Soviet policy on everything from arms control to grain purchases. The damage was incalculable. But what surprised the FBI most was Helen's journal, which they reconstructed from chemical analysis of the burned pages. The fragments they recovered revealed not a hardened spy, but a woman torn apart by the weight of constant deception. One partially recovered entry read, "Today, I taught Mrs. Patterson's granddaughter to make paper cranes. She asked if I had children. I said no. Helen has no children, but Galena did once. A daughter who, Thinks her mother died when she was 3. She would be 13 now. Does she look like me? Would she recognize my voice? These are questions Helen cannot ask. The revelation reframed everything. Helen, Galina Yakova, had left behind a daughter in the Soviet Union, told the child was dead to prevent any security vulnerabilities. For 10 years, she'd lived surrounded by American families, while her own child grew up believing herself an orphan. During his interrogation, Stanley revealed something equally profound. He'd fallen in love with America. Not its government or policies, but its ordinary freedoms, the ability to choose where to live, what to read, which dreams to pursue. He spoke about watching his youth basketball team, kids from dozen different backgrounds playing together, and realizing this kind of casual diversity would be impossible in Moscow. He'd spent a decade stealing America's secrets while slowly being seduced by its promises. Neither Stanley nor Helen served significant prison time. Within 18 months, they were exchanged for American intelligence officers held in the Soviet Union. The trade happened on a foggy morning at Checkpoint Charlie in Berlin, that corridor between worlds where spies crossed like ghosts passing through a wall. But the story didn't end with the exchange. Years later, after the Soviet Union collapsed, documents emerged from the GRU archives. Stanley's final report to Moscow, filed just before his arrest, contained an extraordinary admission. He recommended ending similar operations, arguing that long-term deep-cover intelligence work created an unsolvable paradox. The better the operative, the more completely they inhabited their cover, the more likely they were to be compromised not by enemy action, but by their own humanity. Galina Yakova disappeared after returning to the Soviet Union. Some say she reunited with her daughter. Others that she couldn't face the child she'd abandoned for a mission. Stanley Gusev reportedly became a teacher, though what he taught and where remains classified. The apartment at 2619 Wisconsin Avenue was renovated and rented again within months. Today, a young couple lives there, unaware that their home was once a battlefield in a war fought in whispers and waves. The view still overlooks the Capitol, the same monuments, the same rhythm of government. But for those who know the story, that window represents something more. A reminder that the Cold War was fought not just between nations, but within individual consciences, that the greatest casualties were often not secrets lost, but souls divided, and that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the truth we discover about ourselves.